Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard and Paul Butler, former federal prosecutor and professor at Georgetown School of Law. He is also an MSNBC legal analyst. So, Vaughn, talk to us about the significance of this merger and what this means financially for Trump.
Right, Jose. Number one, this is complicated. This merger deal essentially allows Truth Social to go public as soon as next week. And as a result of these companies merging, Donald Trump now owns more than 78 million of share in this newly merged company. And at a stock price of about $43, that comes out to about a $3 billion plus stake in this company here. And now the part of this is that this is not direct cash that Donald Trump now has at his disposal, but instead, as part of the company going public, there is a 6-month cooling off period before Donald Trump could theoretically sell off his shares. Now, there's a lot that goes into this, including, number one, the fact that this, to a certain extent, the stock price of this company has been artificially inflated by particularly Trump supporters, including some of those that are using Truth Social, trying to boost the price of this company, despite Truth Social having actually had millions of dollars in losses over the course of the last years. This new company infuses cash into Truth Social to continue to operate and exist, but also for potentially Donald Trump to financially benefit off of. If he were to sell his stake in the company, which is a majority, about 60% of the shares he owns, this would amount to more than $3 billion as the stock price holds right now. Of course, 6 months from now, a lot could happen. That stock price could drop. Folks could sell. There's, of course, concern when a majority stakeholder would all but announce his intention, which he has not yet. But if he were to announce his intention to sell in order to get cash relief, that could, of course, cause concerns for the other investors in this company. And so that is where, for Donald Trump, the $464 million judgment that he's going to have to pay or get an appeal bond for come Monday is not going to be able to be covered by this merger. At the same time, for the long-term cash considerations for Donald Trump and his family, this could be a significant boost if, in fact, that stock price were to hold, Jose.
And so, Vaughn, do we know if the former president has had any comment on this since the news broke of this? Because earlier in the day, he was talking about that he had $500 million cash already. Any comments or any, coming out of the Trump team?
Right. In real time, Jose, I'm looking at whether Donald Trump himself has actually commented on this merger here, and the answer is no. But I can tell you on a separate note here, Jose, this morning at sunrise here on the East Coast, Donald Trump did put an interesting post out in which he claimed, quote, "I currently have almost $500 million in cash." This is a notable claim, one that we don't know whether it's true or not, but Donald Trump's own attorneys earlier this week, in a filing to an appeals court, made the case that Donald Trump did not have the cash to cover this $450 million plus judgment that is owed on Monday, and that the appeals bond, the surety companies that he was going to for this appeals bond, were not willing to use property as collateral. But if, in fact, Donald Trump actually has $500 million cash on hand, that would be a different ballgame. Of course, that runs completely counter to what his own attorneys are claiming. So this is really, over the next 4 days, going to be what we're looking at ahead of Letitia James already making clear that come Monday, she intends to begin going through the courts to try to seize his properties and assets, Jose.
Lots to figure out here. Paul, are there restrictions on how someone like Trump could post bond, or where money comes from, or will courts normally accept, there's nothing common or usual about what we're seeing these days. But Paul, how do you read this?
So Judge Engoron does not trust Donald Trump, so he has required Trump to report all financial transactions involving his organization to the monitor he appointed. He extended the monitor's term for 3 years. And the judge also ordered Trump to inform the monitor of his efforts to secure a bond. So what does this mean? The judge is concerned that Trump might try to hide or transfer his assets, or that Trump might be making misrepresentations to bond companies about the value of his properties. Trump's lies about the value of his properties is why he's on the line now for almost $500 million.
So, Paul, is there a difference between what one says or certifies legally and then what one says, in the court of public opinion? I mean, as Vaughn was, reading it partially, he says he's got $500 mil in the bank, cash, liquid. But earlier this week, his lawyers were saying that he doesn't have that kind of money. Is there a difference there, Paul? I mean, could one thing have an impact on the other?
Well, it's not the first time that Trump lawyers are saying one thing and Trump is saying another. So obviously what's the most important is what's said in court, because lawyers have to attest to the truth of what they file in court. Trump may be looking ahead to this deal, thinking that that will allow him to post bond, but he's not going to have that cash on Monday. There's this 6 months issue. He's got to wait 6 months before he's allowed to access his shares. And Jose, he could work out a deal to get that money earlier, but that would have to be approved by the board of this new company. But guess who would be on the board? Don Jr., Trump allies like Kash Patel and people who he appointed to positions in his administration. So they might actually go for this deal, allowing Trump to access his shares earlier, even though, as Vaughn said, that's probably not in the best financial interest of the company.